Renewable energy was the stimulant to the modernized grid, in the post-SCADA grid. I sometimes call renewables the grain of sand that's in the oyster. It was necessary to modernize the grid to deal with the variability and the other impacts of renewables. And I want to emphasize in my next three slides that renewables are not just driven by climate change. Renewables are driven because they are emerging as a least cost generation source. And I'll show you some data on that. This is a very important point. The cost of integration is low if the grid is bigger, faster, smarter. In other words, if it's modernized. New business and market models also depend on grid modernization. So you can't aggregate batteries, you can't do behind-the-meter services without a modernized grid. But grid modernization requires investment, and I'll show you some numbers on that. And then finally, I'm advocating a systematic approach to both grid modernization and distribution reform, and I'll explain the connection there. Okay, now this is the World Utility Summit, and so I want to say something about countries outside of South Asia. I've been involved in Indian and South Asian energy for 3 decades now, but as the World Energy Summit, we also should be looking at what some of the neighboring countries are encountering. So 4 things that I'm seeing in my work with large power systems in Central Asia and Eastern Europe are that countries often do renewable procurement without planning for grid integration. You can imagine that that doesn't work out terribly well. The linkage between grid modernization and new utility models is often very slow to be recognized. You can't aggregate batteries. You can't control your distributed energy resources without a modernized grid. It's also quickly recognized that market mechanisms are necessary to deal with renewables, and market mechanisms also require a modernized grid. You see the theme there. And then finally, in the countries outside of South Asia that I'm working with now, all of them initially think that batteries are the silver bullet that will solve the grid integration problem. So let me just quickly point out the least cost nature of renewables in the world. What I'm telling you is that people deploy renewables not just because of climate, not just because of national policy, but when you see prices as low as $24 per megawatt hour in Tunisia or in UAE, $17 per megawatt hour for PV. Contrast that with the largest coal plant in UAE, which is 8.2 cents a kilowatt hour, or their gas plants, which are about 6.5 cents. So people are adopting renewables because it makes economic sense. We're also seeing in the US and in other countries that new wind and solar is coming in cheaper than just the operating cost of thermal plants, coal and gas plants. So this is 2 wind PPAs compared to just the operating cost of a particular utility in the US's coal and gas plant. And we're also finding that renewables are coming in new at levels that are below wholesale market prices. This is an example of the cheapest wind PPA in Duke Energy's system compared to the future wholesale price off-peak in the MISO market, MISO Midwest ISO. Now, this conference is talking about evolving business models for distribution. Sustainable Electric Power Alliance in the US did a review of emerging models. They found 5. And the point I'm going to make here is that a modernized grid is required for any of these models to succeed. And let's look at some of the new utility services and approaches that are entering the market. Smart meters, batteries, time of day rates, aggregation, EV charging, curtailable load. All of these depend on a foundation of a modernized grid. I hope you see the theme there. A modernized grid is important. So the National Renewable Energy Laboratory often says, what's needed to integrate renewables? A bigger, faster, smarter grid. That's their little catchphrase. And what that means is that there has to be substantial modernization and investment in the grid, and I'll get into that in a moment. Some people incorrectly say that integrating renewables is too expensive. The data for North America and Europe are very consistent and clear. It costs between $2 and $6 a megawatt hour to integrate renewables in North America and the EU. But the bad news is that that only works in a modernized grid. The converse is also true. It's much more expensive to integrate renewables in a non-modernized grid. If you look at ancillary services, which everybody's talking about nowadays, some people say, well, per megawatt or per megawatt hour, ancillary services are very expensive. Sure, but they're not used that much. They're used for a very small amount of hours during the year. And so if you look at a system like the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland system, their total cost of ancillary services in these 5 years was only about less than 1% of the delivered cost of energy. So your ancillary services aren't expensive, but what do they need? A modernized grid. So what's the problem? Renewables may be a low-cost generation option. Renewables require serious integration efforts and new market mechanisms. But integration and market mechanisms need a modernized grid. New energy business models also require a modernized grid. So the modernized grid is a foundation for power sector transformation. It's a theme of this whole conference. But utilities need the financial capacity to modernize the grid. Now let me say just a little bit about that. Around 2004, when renewables began to enter the US market at a dramatically large scale, the US utilities dramatically increased their investment in the T&D systems. You can see that it's well over 100% increase in investment across the United States. Why? Because they had to do it to modernize the grid. And if you look at the cost per unit, the investment in the grid was soaring, or the costs related to the grid was soaring. Per customer, it was soaring. So that gives you the idea that the grid is becoming more important in our electrical systems. And that's partly because we want to reach into the renewable, the least cost generation. I won't even say renewable. We want least cost generation. And the only way that it works is if the grid can deal with the variability. So to wrap it up, most utilities should have a rolling plan for grid modernization. Whatever you're doing, you should start it today and you should be revising it regularly. The plan generally should relate to the strategic new businesses and services that you want to offer. And our other experts are going to go over that in good detail in a moment. Relevant to South Asia, where AT&C losses tend to be high in some utilities, in the majority of utilities actually, DISCO financial performance drives the ability to invest. And so that creates that linkage between your commercial end of the business, your AT&C losses, and your grid modernization. And therefore, improving DISCO financial performance should be a very high priority along with grid modernization. So with that said, I thank you for your attention, and I'm sure this discussion will be fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks, Allen, actually, for giving a very good insight into the subject. And I would like to highlight a few points of his presentation. He actually informed what is the real problem the utilities are facing, why we need to modernize actually the grids, what are the problems faced in the integration when we have renewables, and also he gave a very good cost comparison also from the US perspective, which can be done for other countries also. And also what he said that future will be, future is to modernize the grids. So I think we should give a very good round of applause for giving a very good insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would now like to invite Mr. Volker Hild from Siemens to give us memento to Allen for as a token of appreciation. Thanks, Allen.